You have a moral duty to make yourself as unignorant and as unstupid as you possibly can. So I was very judgmental, and I think that helped me. It also helped me that I kept changing my judgments as I learned more and more facts came in, and that created lifelong habits that were very, very useful. Another thing that I think really helped me is, particularly on my father's side of the family, my paternal grandfather was the only federal judge in Lincoln, Nebraska, the capital city of Nebraska. And he'd been there forever, and he stayed there forever after that. I think when he left, he was the longest serving federal judge in the country. And he was a brilliant man, and he'd risen from nothing. He was the child of two impoverished school teachers. And when he was raised in a little town in Nebraska, they'd give him a nickel to go buy the meat, and he'd go to the butcher shop, and he would buy the parts of the animal nobody else would eat. And that's what two school teachers lived on in those days. And the very indignity of it bothered him so much that he just determined to get out of poverty and never go back. And he did. He got ahead like Abe Lincoln, educated himself in lawyers' offices and so on. He had to leave college because he couldn't pay the tuition anymore. But he educated himself, and since he was utterly brilliant, it wasn't all that hard. And he had an attitude that was pretty damn extreme. And I would say his attitude was that you have a moral duty to make yourself as unignorant and as unstupid as you possibly can. And that it was pretty much your highest moral duty. Maybe taking care of your family came first, but in the ranks of moral obligations, quasi-religious, well, he was conventionally religious, so it may have been a religious duty to him. But he really believed that rationality was a moral duty. 30s came. One son-in-law was a musician, and of course he couldn't make a living. So my grandfather didn't have that much money, sent him to pharmacy school, carefully picking a profession that couldn't fail, and found him a bankrupt pharmacy to buy and loaned him the money, and my uncle was soon prosperous and remained prosperous the rest of his life. My other uncle had a bank in Stroudsburg, Nebraska, but there were 968 people in Stroudsburg, and there were two national banks. And the capitalization of my uncle's bank was $25,000. And of course, he was a lovely man, but he was an optimist, and a banker should not be an optimist. And when they closed the banks in 1933, the banking examiners came in and they said, "You can't reopen." And it was the only business he had. Well, Judge Munger had always saved his money, and he had a lot of good first mortgages on. What my grandfather did is take a third of his good mortgages, which is all he had, and put them into the bank and took all the lousy assets out of the bank. So he saved 2 out of 3 of his children, and I thought it was a pretty good thing to do, and very shrewd the way he did it. And he actually got most of his money back 10 or 15 years later out of all the lousy assets of the bank from World War II. And that was a good lesson. And the other family, the guy was an honors graduate of the Harvard School of Architecture, and he was very prosperous in the 20s. And the 30s came, the total building permits in Omaha would sometimes be $25,000 a month. And that was for furnace repairs or something. There was just no work, none, zero. So he moved to California, and he lived for several years. And finally he got the County of Los Angeles to hire this great Harvard architect. And he got $108.08 a month after deductions. And they had him do drafting work, but they classified him as a laundryman to save money. And he could actually rent a house for $25 and feed himself and drive an old car. He could live on $109 a month. Amazing how poor everybody was. And what happened to that grandfather is along came the FHA, and they had a competitive civil service examination. And he was a very brilliant man. Of course, he was first in the exam, and that made him the chief architect of the FHA in Los Angeles, where he spent the rest of his life. But I watched all this family coping with all this difficulty. And I'll say this, it sounds awful, but they weren't all that unhappy. You can cope pretty well because you get used to it. That's the nice thing about the human condition. All these people were educated and civilized and generous and decent, and a lot of them had good senses of humor. And it was a pretty damn good place to grow up in. And my memory is of being surrounded by a lot of very fine people. All those old-fashioned values, family comes first, be in a position so you can help others when troubles come, prudent, sensible, moral duty to be reasonable, more important than anything else, more important than being rich, more important than being important. An absolute moral duty, because none of my intelligent relatives suffered terribly because they didn't advance higher. When I was young, I could get an A in any mathematics course without doing any work at all. And so I always took math because it meant that I could literally, I never did any problem sets, I just did the math. I should not get credit as some budding mathematician. I was choosing what for me was the easiest way to think about what I wanted to instead of what somebody else wanted me to do. But this will interest you in this world where people have all these algorithms and computer science and fancy math and so forth. Neither Warren or I have ever used any fancy math in business, and neither did Ben Graham, who taught Warren. Everything I've ever done in business could be done with the simplest algebra and geometry and addition, multiplication, and so forth. I never used calculus for any practical work in my whole damn life. And I was a perfect whiz at it when they taught it to me. And by the way, since I never touched calculus, not one after I was 19 years old, I've lost it. But I think you'll find that if you really know the basic stuff, it's enormously useful, and only a very few people are ever going to need any calculus. Well, my grandfather and father had been lawyers, and I knew I didn't want to do everything else. It's very simple. I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want all the blood and misery and so forth, and the repetitive work. I knew I didn't want to go to the bottom of a big organization and crawl my way up. I'm a natural contrarian. That was not going to work for me. And I found that people could tell me when I thought they were idiots, and that is not a way to rise in a big organization. And so I couldn't do that. Now I'm left with law, and I admired my father and grandfather, and a good life for them, so I naturally drifted into it. I probably got paid about $350,000 in my first 13 years of law practice total. And I had an army of children and no capital to start with. And when I chose this alternative career, I had over $300,000 in liquid instruments. So I had, and that was 10 years of living expenses. So I was not a courageous, venturesome, admirable man. I was a cautious little squirrel, saving up more nuts than I really needed and not going very deep into my pile of nuts. So it wasn't that courageous, and I kept one foot in the law firm while I tried my capitalist career. But as soon as the capitalist career succeeded, I intended to lift that second foot because I recognized that the potential of law practice, as I saw it then, I didn't anticipate the boom that came to the big firm. I just saw it as being more difficult. And I wanted more independence than I was going to have as a lawyer. I hated sending other people invoices and needing money from richer people. I thought it was undignified. I wanted my own money. Not because I loved ease or social prestige. I wanted the independence. Well, I had $3 or $4 million, which was a lot of money then. And I also knew how to handle that $3 or $4 million very well at that time. And so I knew I didn't need to get fees and overrides from other investors. And I found that when you got into things like the 74-75 crunch, which was the worst since the 30s, I didn't suffer. I knew everything was going to work out. But the quoted prices of these things really went down to ridiculous levels. And some of my investors I knew were suffering. You know, they needed the money. And of course, I have enough of a fiduciary gene that pained me greatly. And so I said, well, it's just, my fiduciary gene was giving me pain. And I said, the hell with it. I lanced the carbuncle. I just lived on my own money. No fees, no overrides, no salaries.
And so at what point did you meet Warren? And
1959.
And so where did Berkshire Hathaway come from in terms of this partnership that you all have now had for decades?
Well, Warren had been taught by Ben Graham to buy things for less than they were worth, no matter how lousy the business was. You can't imagine a more lousy business than New England textile mills, because textile is a congealed electricity. And the electricity rates in New England were about 60% higher than TVA rates. So it was absolute, inevitable, certain liquidation. Now, Warren should have known better than to buy into a totally doomed enterprise, but it was so damn cheap, he could buy it at a big discount from liquidating value. So he bought a big chunk, and finally ended up in control of the business. But the business was going to die, so the only way to go forward from there was to wring enough money out of this declining textile business to have more money than he paid to get in and use it to buy something else. Well, that's a very indirect way to proceed, and I would not recommend it to any of you. Just because we did some dumb thing that worked, you don't have to repeat our path. And of course, we eventually learned not to buy these cigar butts when they were cheap and do these painful liquidations, and instead buy better businesses. That's the main secret of Berkshire. The reason that Berkshire has been successful as a big conglomerate, more successful than any other big conglomerate, so far as I know, any other big conglomerate in the world. The reason it's been successful is we try and buy things that aren't going to require much managerial talent at headquarters. Everybody else thinks they've got a lot of managerial talent at headquarters, and that's a lot of hubris. If the business is lousy enough, it gets a wonderful manager. The business has a lousy reputation, and the manager has a good reputation. It's the reputation of the business that's going to remain intact. You can't fix these really lousy businesses. You can wring the money out, whatever comes in liquidation, and do something else with it. But most lousy businesses can't be fixed. And Warren didn't know anything about running a windmill company. He bought it because it was cheap. He said, what do you do? Why can't you fix my windmill company? Who can you get to help me? I said, I've got just the man for you. And so one of my old colleagues from a transformer business who was an accountant, I said, he will fix your windmill company. And Warren was desperate. He just hired him on the spot. But he just made so much money in this other stuff, and he'd been taught it by Ben Graham. It was hard for him to quit when he was just coining money. But he saw the point. And well, you couldn't scale that business. and and it was kind of scrounchy and unpleasant, and you're firing people. Who in the hell wants to do that? So we just wrung the money out and bought better businesses, and we've been doing it ever since. We generally buy with the talent in place. Now, maybe some guy in the number 2 place and we put him in the number 1 place. But we very seldom, I can't think of any place where we bought something and put somebody in after Harry Bottle. And no, we don't do that. And it's amazing how long we have some of those people stay. Warren always says we can't teach the new dogs the old tricks. Our practices may not be the norm, but normally it's very hard to get you got a wise old dog, getting a young dog that can match him, that's hard. By definition, he's survived a big culling process.
Sure.
I mean, he's unique, and he's got a record to prove it. And by the way, everybody thinks you can judge people by an interview. And of course, you know who you like and who you don't like, but everybody overestimates how much you can tell in prediction by meeting somebody. We all like to think that we have that capacity, but it's a vastly stupid type of overconfidence. The paper record has about 3 times the predictive value of your impression in an interview, and of course, we're buying great paper records. Well, it isn't like we're still hiring young dogs into these businesses. But it's amazing how much of the record of Berkshire has come from the old dogs who are in the business when we buy them. You can't believe how good those people have been. When I see Congress on my television set and the degree of hatred they have, utter contempt, I mean, really serious, way more than is usual. It's evil to hate that much. It's a mistake to hate that much. That much hatred will turn. It's always been true. As anger comes in, reason leaves. It's a truism. So do you want to adopt a political point of view where you're angry all the time? If you do, welcome to the house of misery. And pretty low worldly achievement to boot. So if that's what you want, you just found out how to do it. Behave like those people you see on television. Just as the Moonies go crazy because they hang around together, so do our politicians. Yeah. And do you want to go crazy? Is that what your ambition in life? You start with some advantage. Just make yourself a violently believing politician on either side. I think that technology changes the world, and that reminds me of a thing. If I ask you what was the worst single mistake in the work of Adam Smith, I know I'd get I don't see everybody big eyes lighting up. The biggest mistake in the work of Adam Smith, he was totally right about markets and so on, and the advantages of trade, division of labor, and so forth. What he missed was how much a steady advance of technology would advance wealth and standards of living. He, in the 1700s, was living not too much differently from the way they lived in the Roman Empire, and he just missed it. And there, in fact, had been huge improvements in technology, but he just missed it. He wasn't very technically minded, and it was really stupid. And now I'll ask you a harder question. What was the worst mistake David Ricardo made? I'll tell you the answer. David Ricardo he got the first order consequences of trade perfectly right. And it was not an obvious insight, and it was a great achievement, but he didn't think about the second order consequences. He wasn't mathematical enough to see, and he wasn't mathematical to think what would happen when one country had way higher living standards than another. And he like Adam Smith, he missed. And the main issue in a place like the United States is if you have an advanced nation and some other nation which is numerous, but the people, if anything, are better on average than yours in terms of their innate quality, which I think is roughly true of China. And they're in poverty. They're living in caves, and they're caught in a Malthusian trap. And you got an advanced economy, and you suddenly go into free trade. What is going to happen is, Ricardo proved it, both sides are going to live better, right? But the people here that are assimilating all the great economies of the world in China, they're going to go up way faster. So you go up 2% a year, and they go up 12%. And pretty soon they're the dominant nation in the world, and you aren't. Well, are you really better off? Well, the answer is no. But one of the interesting problems of that is you can't understand Ricardo properly in thinking about the United States vis-a-vis free trade with China without thinking about the tragedy of the commons. Because if we had the only nation in the world, except for China, we could say we won't trade with them, we'll just leave them in their damned agricultural poverty, and we'll just, and we could probably have done that. But the whole rest of the world will trade with. They're going to rise anyway. So we don't have any power to hold back the rise of China by not trading with them. So we had to do what we did. And once you do that, now they're going to be a greater power than we are. And the two of us are going to be big enough so we can accomplish pretty nearly anything we both want to do. So we have to be friendly with China. You have a moral duty to make yourself as unignorant and as unstupid as you possibly can. It's amazing how if you just get up every morning and keep plugging and have some discipline and keep learning, and it's amazing how it works out okay. And I don't think it's wise to have an ambition to be president of the United States or a billionaire or something like that, because the odds are too much against you. Much better to aim low. I did not intend to get rich. I wanted to get independent. I just overshot. And yeah, so I was very judgmental.